Hi, I'm Cynthia Simmons. I'm the team with Paul Moorcroft, Marcio Macedo, and Lisa Famolore. We've been talking for the past 2 months about science and knowledge and how we can create it and bring it back to stakeholders and decision makers. Yes, I'd like to start by thanking my group. I've had a really great time. I think it's been very productive. And thank the organizers on behalf of the group. This is a very interesting workshop, and I think we all are going to learn a lot from it. So, okay. So we've been talking about what science can be created, how it can be brought back down to stakeholders, and 4 questions kept coming up in our discussions, and we used those 4 questions to really guide our presentation today. The first question was, what is the future of the Amazonia? What type of problems do we need to deal with? What can science actually address? What analyses have been done to date already to address those issues? What are some of the gaps in knowledge? And then what are some of our recommendations about the different possibilities? And this isn't moving. Is there, I just pushed arrow, or I'm about to switch to Mac, so it's like, so I have to do it from the side? Yeah. So what are the challenges? And these can be opportunities or they can be threats, as we interpret it. First, there was an agreement that climate change is a big issue. Climate change is an issue around the world. It's problematic in the Amazon. And we really need to think about what can be done, what we can know about that. We also discussed the global demand for food and minerals, which is very much linked to Brazil and other nations in South America and the Amazon region, their desire to develop economically. And exploiting those resources, that comparative advantage has been the focus. And to do that, the countries have been organizing and planning for infrastructure. The integration of infrastructure across the Amazon. And this is the URSA project, which I'm sure you all know about, but there are also many national plans. And we also were discussing, well, these plans are happening within like this 5-year time frame, that politicians make decisions in this 5-year time frame. And so understanding these problems are really important. This is a map that my students have been helping me put together. Agani and Mike aren't here. Mike's not here right now, but trying to put all the data layers together. It's kind of really a messy map right now, but just to give a sense of the magnitude of the projects that are planned. And this includes, the dams, but then waterways, railroads, as well as a port system. The idea is to create infrastructure in order to create efficiencies, logistics, such that they can promote industrialization, which is something that hasn't been addressed as much when it comes to looking at land change in the Amazon. And so I'm not going to go too much detail about all the different projects, but there are many projects, millions of kilometers of roads that they want to pave. There's 600 plus dams, including what's already there. It's the magnitude is really quite large when we put it all together, all the pieces together. And what tools are being used now, the environmental impact assessment is limited. What can it really tell us about the impacts that are going to come from not just one project, but multiple projects? And so in terms of the environmental impact assessment, they're always project specific. And because they're project specific, they don't really address the combined impact of multiple projects. Not just one dam, 2 dams, but the dam and the waterway and the railroad that are all in the same hub, that are all part of creating efficiency in infrastructure. And so that's problematic. We really want to get at what the impacts and what the changes are going to be in the future. Since they're project specific, they're also spatially myopic. They focus on within the vicinity. They oftentimes miss what are the non-contiguous impacts that may be happening very far from the actual site. One example, the Tucuri Dam. Yes, there's impacts from the dam itself and the reservoir and the transmission lines, but the biggest impacts happened in Barcarena with the bauxite and the industrialization that occurred the whole southeastern part of Pará, and has some of the most modern slaughterhouses. That made a really big change in the region. We're not considering those as we're looking at infrastructure. As I said, there's spillover effects. They're oftentimes non-contiguous. They're oftentimes short-run and focus, and so they miss any impacts that may be longer. So relaxation to species extinctions. You may have an impact, but yet the species they don't go extinct until later, or the delays in economic development. So it's really hard to get at the real impact just by looking at the EIAs, and they aren't really taking into account climate change. And of course, that can exacerbate the effectiveness of the various measures, reduce hydropower potential and such. So what is the future of Amazonia, we thought, and will the infrastructure actually bring about the development and improved social welfare that the countries hope it will? Will it spark the engine of growth in the region and trickle down to the masses and improve their overall conditions? If there is agricultural intensification, people move to the cities, will that basically allow that land sparing as people in forced transition move away from extraction? So there's very different possibilities, and that could benefit traditional peoples and biodiversity. Or will the cumulative and synergistic impacts that we're not considering actually, coupled with global climate change, bring about a really opposite effect, inhibit development, inhibit growth, and lead to unplanned development, in migration of land-hungry farmers, and just an expansion of the business as usual. And the big question as well is, well, where will those threats materialize? Because they're not going to happen ubiquitously across the Amazon. They're going to be in very specific places, and if we can identify where those places are, then maybe we can plan for it. And the answer we had is a big question mark. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the future holds. The Amazon future is unknown, and so this is a place where science and science-based modeling strategies can try to address. And so, can science be used as a tool for conservation and development? Can it generate the information necessary to reduce the risk, to reduce the uncertainty so that policymakers make better choices? If so, what information do they need? We discussed. Can the gap be bridged between science creation and delivery to those decision makers? Oftentimes this is where the big gap is. Great science is done and it's in a journal, and it doesn't get brought down to the decision makers. Can it be transformed into a format, into a platform that can actually inform local stakeholders? And so these were questions we were discussing over the past couple of months, and we came to the conclusion, yes. Now how that can happen, but it can happen. We're very confident. So then we thought about what has been done to date. What have people been doing? And we looked at two different types of science-based analyses that have been done. One that's more national, local environmental impact assessments, example, Tremarctos. The other more the modeling-based science approaches that have been done. And Tremarctos, I'm not going to go into great detail, is a system of early warning system, and it collects all the very important information in a database. It's being used in Colombia and other countries, but it's before it gets to the stage of an environmental impact assessment. Before they actually commit to where the project's going to be, they can scope it out and decide that maybe it'd be better not to do the project, or to move the project elsewhere, or the cost may be too great and investors may not want to make an investment in the project. So it's an early warning system. Here's an example of how they created their impact assessments for road, and another one for a impact for petroleum. And the output actually can be given to the decision makers or to the local community so they can be engaged. And discussing this, what were the takeaway points we all came to, some of the conclusions. One is that Tremarctos is good at knowledge creation, and it's really good at dissemination. So it gets to the decision makers. It provides critical information that can help reduce that uncertainty and risk. It's open access, so it allows communities to get access to the data and use it. The only problem is, and it's not really a problem, it's just the scope, because it is project specific, so it doesn't get at those cumulative and synergistic impacts that will come from multiple projects across the basin. But we thought it's a good model or an approach to think about how can we have a similar early warning system but for the whole entire basin, a similar type of an approach. So then we talked about some of the science-based models that have been done, looking at infrastructure, looking at climate, land change. There's been a lot done on land change. Many of the people in the room have done much of the science behind it. One example you may remember, Bill Lawrence had a paper out in 2001 where he and his group warned that there's potential impacts from all the new projects in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, from Avança Brasil. He used a cartographic approach, and so you can see here his their modeling. They basically used all of the hydro, the reservoir, the roads, and they treated them the direct impacts and kind of created these cartographic buffers. And through scenarios under good governance versus bad governance, how in fact potential deforestation that may occur. There's been other projects in Amazonia. Econometrics have been used to gauge the impact, especially between roads and landscape change. And then at the local scale, others projects looking at what is the motivation behind the decision making, the processes that lead to the patterns of land change, not just the patterns of land change. There's been a lot of work done, a lot we can draw on. In terms of global and regional climate models, Carlos Nobre talked much about that last night, so I don't have to talk too much about it. But there's been a lot done as well. How does global climate impact the Amazon, as well as, well, how does that interact with regional climate to have, exacerbate the outcomes? And here we have 3 examples we were discussing. The first, Paul Moorcroft and his group, we're looking at linking the human land systems with climate, with CO2, and regional climates in modeling effort to try to get at what would be the potential impact of climate versus land use. And so here's what the results showed is that under business as usual, where there are no real policies to control for land cover, deforestation is great, and proportionally, it may be the largest driver of biomass reductions. However, even under good governance systems, we see that climate change is a real problem. It becomes more important, but it is something to be addressed. And so there have been these models to look at that. The next one we discussed is the paper by a Walker in our group, Protecting Amazonia with Protected Areas. And didn't show up. In a similar way, the idea was if we were to deforest the whole entire basin except for the protected areas, how would that regulate climate? And then linked the spatially explicit land cover change directly to a spatially explicit regional climate change. It didn't take into consideration global climate, but we can actually see how it's spatially distributed, which gives us a good picture of where the problems are. So that's one example of how that can be done. Similarly, another project that was done by Claudia Stickler, Marcia and the group, was looking at how deforestation and hydropower are interconnected. And so looking at various scenarios of land cover change, they were able to look at what impact that has on the hydropower potential. And as you see in the, up to a certain point of deforestation, rate increases, and then after a certain point, 15 to 40% deforestation, you actually see declines in precipitation and discharge. And so the outcome is it doesn't prove positive or good for hydropower potential. And so if we had that information beforehand, it may be very useful to those who are investing in hydropower. So what have we learned? Well, we learned that roads are important drivers of deforestation. We also that there is a link between land change, global climate, and regional climate. And that in fact, deforestation can, after a certain extent, actually reduce the precipitation, reduce the discharge, which will have negative impacts on overall hydropower potential. And that the Amazon basin does function like a coupled natural and human systems. And you have to think about how those systems link in order to get the big picture of the problems to come. But despite these important findings, these findings often don't make it to decision makers. They don't make it to stakeholders, they end up in journals. And that's a real challenge. Well, how do we do the science and get it to stakeholders? What are the gaps quickly? There's an inadequate treatment of infrastructure because in dealing with roads, you're looking at the direct impact, not considering that roads are dynamic and they're changing, and the infrastructure is changing over time. So if you have a fixed grid and you're looking at expanding agriculture and landscape, you're missing that not only is the infrastructure changing, there are all those indirect impacts. The real purpose for the roads and the hydropower and the waterways is to generate industrialization. So why, being focused just on agriculture, it may be important to think about what are potential changes that could be good, and they also could be problematic. A shift in the economy and the spatial economy. And then the treatment of roads as vectors. You have a road going through, and so the direct impact that has on deforestation. So the human systems haven't been adequately specified, that we can have a much more rich understanding of the processes that lead to landscape, and then link the landscape to the climate and the hydrology. Because really, landscape change is the variable that goes into all the other models. And so if you don't have a good understanding of the landscape change, then your models can only produce so much. And the land use scenarios aren't necessarily the best way to go. Good governance, does it work? If you're basing it on business as usual, the expectation is going to stay agriculture. It's going to stay in this type of extensive activity. As the infrastructure is dynamic, the whole idea is, you have roads, it's going to reduce transportation costs, it's going to make new economic activities viable. And where that is going to happen really depends on proximity to markets, it's going to, the efficiencies in the system. And so it's not going to happen ubiquitously across the basin as well. So we can understand that dynamic and get a better sense in the modeling. And there's no really good consideration of global climate change and how demands for goods are driving the infrastructure investments. Okay. There's dissemination gaps, of course, as well. There's little emphasis on scoping the audience ahead of time, who the models are for, what the results and purpose. Oftentimes, local and national researchers aren't involved in the science, and so that becomes problematic when we want them to adopt these understand what we're doing. And scientific papers are oftentimes too scientific, and politicians and policymakers and local stakeholders don't read science papers. A lot of scholars don't read science papers, although they should. And what are our recommendations? So we had, again, thinking in this 5-year time frame, the time frame that politicians think in, as well as, we have a window of opportunity maybe to make a change of the direction and mitigate the problems that are to come as opposed to adapting. Although we need to adapt too, but there's changes we can make. So in this 5-year time frame, what can be done? We discussed that we can do the basin scale modeling. That's truly coupled, I'm almost done. Truly coupled, that brings together the changes in infrastructure investments and how that will change impacts on the human system, potentially attracting more populations. The populations need food, and that may have impacts on the landscape, on land change, which will then have impacts on the hydrological and climate interactions, and will feed back onto potential infrastructure and potential investments in the future. So modeling this, the next step would be to create that interactive and spatially explicit risk assessment that can be brought to decision makers. And we're thinking that would happen in a 3 to 5 year time frame. And then next, to bring it to the stakeholders. If we can actually take the output and put it into an interactive platform that you then can add the data that's of interest to the various stakeholders. They can visually see what threats are coming their way and plan for it. Providing the data to environmental impact assessments to improve the local project studies, because those are important too. They'll still need to do the local projects impact assessments. And can strengthen conservation efforts. If they have a reserve and it's going to be threatened, maybe creating a buffer, creating a refugia to protect that reserve so it's there in the future. Using the results to spur community planning and discussions can be used as well. And then we started talking this lastly is, what are some strategies to engage stakeholders? Because oftentimes the scientists were not the best ones to do it. And scholars, well, what can we do to really engage them, and what are some of the problems? Involving the scientists and decision makers in the beginning, so we're sure their buy-in. the translation of scientific knowledge into knowledge that is understandable. As much of the discussion yesterday at the Learning Day was, how to do just that. Improving scoping ahead of time when it comes to these various platforms that could be created. Engaging that stakeholders from the beginning. And having a decision science that can, based on like open standards of conservation, trying to have shared data and shared information. And so I added the hashtag, and I really stole it from Christy and you guys last night at the table, make Amazon great again, because I didn't have a conclusion. And then I thought, make Amazon great again. Well, Amazon is great. Let's keep it that way. So, thanks.